This episode is brought to you by my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery group program. If you're listening in real time, new groups are forming in April of 2018. Reserve your spot today by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 190. Welcome to the 190th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I recently created a free 3-part video series all about the fertility awareness method and how you can utilize the fertility awareness method to develop body literacy. So to really connect you with your cycles and really understand what's happening in your body. And so if you haven't had a chance to get your copy of my free video series, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101 to gain access to my 3-part video series all about fertility awareness charting. So again, that's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. I'm excited to share today's session with you. In today's episode, I have another edition of my Fertility Awareness Reality Series. And what's fun about this session is that I have Lindsey on the show. And Lindsey was part of my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery group program in the fall. And so in this session, actually, we're catching up after 3 months of not seeing each other. So what's fun about that is that Lindsey has several charts since our last meeting that we're going to be able to go into and really dig into in this session. If you're listening to this episode in real time, then it is mid-March in 2018, and registration for my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery group program is now open. And I'm running 2 separate groups, one group specifically for women who are actively avoiding pregnancy, the other group for women who are trying to conceive or planning to conceive in the near future. And I still have spots available at the time of this recording. I would love to have you in the group. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for more information. Now let's jump into today's episode. And before we jump into today's episode, just a quick reminder that everything that we talk about on this episode here and all of the episodes of this podcast are intended for informational purposes only. You'll always get the best results when you're working with a trained practitioner. And so it's always best to consult with a practitioner before you make any changes. Now, with that in mind, let's jump into today's episode. So I'm really excited to welcome my guest, Lindsey, to the show. Lindsey and I worked together. So at the time of this recording, we worked together last year. She was part of one of my Fertility Awareness Mastery group programs. She was in the birth control group. And so we haven't seen each other for a couple of months. I think it's been maybe 3 months. Does that sound right? Yeah. So I'm really excited to connect back with her, and I'm really excited to have her on the show. So welcome to the show, Lindsey.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, happy to have you. And I thought we could start just with a little bit of background. So you joined the Fertility Awareness Mastery group program last year, and you joined the birth control group. So maybe you could share a little bit about your own birth control history, when you got your period, what that was like, and what kind of drew you into the group at that particular point in time.
Sure. So for a point of reference, I'm 34 now, and my period started when I was 14. And I remember it not being something I was looking forward to, and it was not a very pleasant experience. So I was fully willing to get on birth control kind of as soon as it made sense to do so. So when I was 16, I started on orthotricycline. That was the first one I was on, and I was on that through college with, I don't think I had many side effects. I wasn't paying attention, obviously, at that point in time. Around the time I was about 21, I had what sounded like to the doctors an ovarian cyst burst, which they were never able to see anything on the ultrasounds or anything like that. But given my symptoms, that's what was indicated to them. And so it was nearly instantaneous, horrible abdominal pain that went on for several hours. And then it kind of subsided over the next couple of days. And over the course of my life, I've had 3 instances of that. And I never really put that together with anything else. The doctors were like, well, sometimes this happens. So I continue on birth control. And around the age of 23, I tried Yaz, I think it was. And that only lasted 3 months because I went absolutely crazy on Yasmin. And I remember, poor thing, my boyfriend at the time, he had so much on his hands with me because I would be laughing one minute and crying the next moment and enraged, angry the next minute. And me in the back of my mind is like, this is not normal. What are you talking? Like I could hear myself sound crazy. And so I got off that, but it still didn't really connect that hormones can do this to you. So after that experience, I got on the NuvaRing, and that seemed to be a lot better for me. It was a lot more set it and forget it. And so I didn't have to be on top of a pill every day. It was really a lot easier. And then during my time on NuvaRing, I started to experience painful intercourse with bleeding and stuff like that. And the answer to that problem was a cryosurgery on my cervix. Yes. I cringe at that now, but at the time I'm like, oh, gee whiz, that makes sense. Sure, we'll do it. Then around the age of 27, I got a job that was highly stressful, and the schedule was really variable and all over the place. So at that point, even though I'd never had a child, I haven't had a child yet, Mirena made sense. So I had an IUD put in, and that was the ultimate set it and forget it. And I had the Mirena in for a total of 7 years. So I had it swapped out at the end of the life of the first one at 5 years. During that time, my job was incredibly stressful, and I started to notice symptoms of like chronic fatigue and waves, periods of depression that would come and go, and some other symptoms like that. So this is kind of a funny story. When I had my IUD swapped out, it was election day in the United States in 2016.
Oh, man.
So it was kind of a big day. And my divorce had been finalized the day before. So there was a lot of upheaval in my life. And the doctor that came in to do the swapped out, she meant well. She really did. But she's like, okay, so you're 32 at the time. She's like, and you're telling me you want kids, yet you're putting in a 5-year birth control plan. Maybe we should talk about this. And I'm like, I don't think I'm really in the mood for an existential crisis right now. Can I think about this later? So we did the swap, and I just remember this like profound sense of sadness because I had no idea what the future looked like. And it didn't seem like I was on the path that I wanted to be on. And this was just sort of like a desperate attempt to protect myself until I did get on that path. So moving forward from that kind of painful experience, so I left a difficult relationship, and I left that stressful job, and life was great. Like I loved my life. Everything was wonderful, but I was still having trouble getting out of bed in the morning. The fatigue was getting worse. The depression was a little bit more frequent. And so I started looking into what could this possibly be? So long story short, about 7 months ago, I got a autoimmune diagnosis. So I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's. And since then I've been working pretty diligently with a functional medicine practitioner to clean up my diet, manage supplements, manage lifestyle changes to help root out the trigger, whatever this trigger is. Anticlimatically, we don't know what it is yet. So I can't wrap that story up nice and neat for everyone, but we're still in the middle of that process trying to figure it out. So 2 months or so into working with my functional medicine practitioner, I asked, because I had found your podcast prior to that, and I was binge listening to all the things, and my brain was exploding on a regular basis, and I was literally horrified by everything that I didn't know. And so I was like, I really have this strong feeling I need to get this IUD out. And she said, yes, absolutely do it. Do it as soon as you can. But I knew I didn't want to try to wing it. I want to learn, as much as I can and do it the best that I can. So I signed up for your class, which is the best thing I could have done. I'm so thankful that I was able to find that opportunity because it really has changed my life. And so that kind of brings us to today.
Wow. Well, Lindsey, thank you for taking us through your journey. Yeah, it's very hard. I think it's interesting as an interviewer because you basically summed up almost 20 years of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, no, 20 because you had your
Yes,
first period
20
when you
years.
were 14. Yeah. So,
Yep.
and you're 34. So you basically just summed up 20 years of your life in the last 5 minutes or so. And so I always feel like I need a minute to have it all set in and kind of sink in. But yeah, you had an interesting time on the hormonal contraceptives. I think it's interesting because doing these interviews, as you know, I've spoken to so many women who've used hormonal contraceptives. So many women who are just coming on the show to share their stories, and many women who are professionals. So women who I'm interviewing for another purpose, they may share their experience on hormonal contraceptives. And so regardless, not all women have the same experience, but I've heard many of the same type of symptoms pop up. There's always these similar
Mm-hmm.
threads. So it's like everything in me not to get more and more angry. uh,
Yes.
um, but yeah, so you were working with a functional practitioner trying to sort everything out. And then somewhere amidst that process, you decided to have the Mirena out. So based
Mhm.
on my information, you took it out about August last year, so August 2017. And
Mhm.
so at the time of this recording, we're in February. So September, October, November, December, January. So it's been about 6-ish months or 7-ish months since you've had the IUD out.
I'm on cycle number 7
Cycle
right
7.
now.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so we have a lot to talk about. I know we covered a lot in our time together. So at the time of this recording, we are done. The 10-week program finished last year, and so we've had several months even in between that. So I'm excited to kind of see your charts and hear a little bit about what's been happening since we saw each other last. But I suppose a good place to start is just that. Maybe you could share with me what has been happening since we had our last session, and of course, what your, the top things that you want to make sure we talk about in our session today.
So our sessions ended in November, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
November, December. Okay. So since then, the work with the functional medicine practitioner has really sort of consumed my field of view. Like that's been the sole focus of a lot of the stuff that I've been doing. So diet is obviously a huge piece. Anyone with autoimmunity who's working on it knows how sensitive you can be to some triggers. Like I didn't realize that eggs, I used to eat eggs almost every day, and I was a vegetarian for a while. So that was like a staple protein for me back in those days. But I've realized now how I react to it and I can't have them. So I'm curious to see how these things are showing up in my cycle. Last cycle's kind of, it was neat. Well, I got the flu and it was neat to see it show up in my chart. I mean, it's miserable to have the flu, but it's so cool because you teach that the stuff is going to show up in your chart. You're going to be able to see it happen. Yeah, I can see very easily the day when I got that first fever with the flu.
It's so interesting. I'm glad that you said that. It's interesting because this is the kind of stuff that we talk about in the group. It's like no one else would be not excited to have the flu. Okay, but
Yeah.
but it's really neat. Yeah. What's helpful is that when your chart gets wonky, you're not left to think like, what the heck is going on? So when was the flu? Let's take a look at your chart.
So the flu was January 5th.
Okay. So this previous chart here.
Yep, and that was day 6 of that cycle. Yep.
Yeah. So of course listeners can't see the chart, but basically on the 5th, we have on the 5th and the 6th in particular, the 5th, day 6. So that's day 6 of the chart. We have like a super high temperature that is clearly not part of the normal temperature pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we dig into the charts, I just want to kind of check in with you. So I'm going to take a peek at your observations. So it looks like you've been doing your observations pretty diligently. So nothing's kind of standing out there.
I do tend to blow off dry days.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, incomplete that makes the entire picture. See in my chart, and when I input this, so I record everything in Kindara because I have to do it like as soon as it happens or I'll forget. And so obviously my phone's always with me. That's the easiest place to do it. And so translating from Kindara into the Justice app is, you kind of have to fudge some of the things just a little bit. Like the Kindara has, for the cervical position observations, there's a medium.
Yeah, I get
soft,
that feedback
medium,
a lot.
firm. Right.
No
And with Justice, there is not that medium. So you kind of have to fudge it. But so when I have a dry day, I tend to not put anything in Kindara, which means I was trying to be faithful in the inputting it into Justice that, I don't want to just fill in the blanks. I just want to leave the blank.
Well,
so
as I always say, there's no chart shaming here.
Okay.
We don't do that here.
Good.
So what Lindsey's referring to, I mean, they're just different charting systems. So ultimately, there's a lot of overlap, but there's just some differences. So in the system that I use, there's a lot of specificity with regards to mucus charting. So we're really getting into the nitty gritty and identifying the different types, and it's in a different way. So we're identifying the different types of mucus based on color, based on how much the mucus stretches, if it does stretch, and then of course the sensation that you get when you're wiping. So in terms of just in the general sense, it's fairly common. So I would say it's in some ways more common with my clients who are actively trying to conceive. For my clients who are actively trying to conceive, it makes sense to think, okay, the only thing that matters is when I see mucus. So on the days I see mucus, I'm gonna be super like on top of it and like write everything down. And then when I know I've ovulated, I'm gonna like just ignore everything because I've ovulated. Like, so it makes sense in a way, like when you think of it like that. Like what I obviously encourage us to do when we were working together during our time together is because there's two aspects of the charting that I'm paying attention to. So of course, the one aspect in your case, you're avoiding pregnancy. So we want a good, clear chart so that we can be very clear on which days are fertile, which days are not, and all of that. But then the second part of it is just, so the only kind of reason why it would matter to pay closer attention to what you're seeing on the dry days is so that we can really know what's happening hormonally, and we can also pay attention to cervical health and that kind of thing. So that's the only kind of reason why I would encourage you to note that. So what I would be looking for is ideally when you have your dry days in the pre-ovulatory phase and then again in the post-ovulatory phase, what we would hope to see are dry, like bone dry. So meaning that when you wipe it, it feels dry or smooth. And when you're looking at the tissue, there's either nothing there or maybe there's a little shininess. So that would be what we would expect to see. So when we're seeing something different, when we're seeing either wetness on the tissue or if we're seeing actual mucus outside of the times when we would expect to see it, that's the information that I want. So that's why I would, encourage you to do that. So just to give you a couple of tips. So I would say a good 60% of my clients also use Kindara or another charting app. And so the good thing about Kindara is that it allows you to add in all of the, I don't know if there's a limit to how many sections you can add in. And so I've had it depends on the client. So I've had clients who will add in all of the they'll just add in a bunch of unique selections for different types of mucus. I don't know that that's necessary, but I've had clients that go in and they'll actually add in all the notations. And then there's always just the comments. So yeah, the only thing I would say is you could just keep a note of was the tissue shiny? Was there nothing there? Was the tissue damp? And then leave it at that. And then you could probably just add a little damp, shiny, nothing.
That makes sense.
Or so the notation for nothing on the tissue at all is 0. So you could do 0, shiny, damp, or something like that.
So that brings up another issue. Nearly all of my mucus observations this whole time have happened while checking cervical position and no other time. And I know that that's not the advised way to do it because internal observations can be confusing and misleading. But so my first cycle, which happened while we were in the class, it was a dry cycle. And your recommendation was vitamin A on the cervix, since you knew that I'd had that cryosurgery and the IUD history. And so I've just continued that. So it's become an everyday habit. And that's when I get my best observation. And so anything that I observe on my finger after that check, I'll check for anything that stretches. And if anything stretches, I mark it down. I may have had in the last several months only one or two mucus observations that are actually on the tissue.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, ultimately, and I think we spoke about this a little bit in the group. So if you check your cervix and you end up having like actual peak mucus that you can stretch between your fingers, that's not an observation that you can ignore. That's a pretty clear observation that you need to be marking down. So I would say that in that situation, that makes perfect sense. And I would just, I suppose, to be diligent, I check in with you. So I get the sense that you're pretty diligent with your observations. So, and you've been kind of consistent with it throughout this time. So even kind of now that we haven't been, seeing each other for like every week for the past couple of months, how are you finding checking throughout the day? Are you still finding that, is it easy for you to be consistent with that kind of checking throughout the day? Are you still checking before and after you go to the bathroom? Like just in general, are there times when it's easier than others?
To be honest, on a day that I've already got the mucus observation from the cervical check, I'm less diligent because I know how it seems very unlikely that I'm going to get a better observation later on in the day.
Yeah.
Right. So on those days, I'm not as diligent. In the pre-ovulatory phase after my period, I'm like a hawk on every single time. And then after I get the temperature indication of an ovulation, then I get a little less diligent as well. But I've noticed that my mucus ovulation. So I'm wondering if that's a function of the misleading observations from an internal check.
So you cut out right when you said that. Did you say that you continue to see mucus after ovulation?
Yes. So after my ovulation, it seems like I'll have 3 to 5 days of persistent mucus after that.
So when you have mucus post ovulation, what type of mucus are you seeing? Is it clear, stretchy mucus?
It is. It is, yeah.
All right. So in this chart here, it looks as though ovulation likely happened on day 22 of the chart, like the day before the shift.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm looking at an old chart here. And so you had peak mucus on the day of ovulation and the days leading up to it. And then you had peak mucus on day 23 and then again on day 25. And then after that, did it stop? Do you remember?
Yes, it did.
Yeah. What I can say to that is, I mean, it is normal to some extent to have mucus still even the day after, because it's not all the time that ovulation happens directly on peak day. So peak day is the last day that you have mucus that's clear or stretchy or slippery. And so about 70% of the time, 70-ish% of the time, you would expect to ovulate like on peak day or the day before or the day after. So It is fairly, I would say, common then to have mucus even the day after, because then that would still mean that like it's within that normal range. And so then, 90% of the time you could ovulate up to 2 days after, but that's kind of the reverse. So basically, if you think about it from the hormonal perspective, in order to shut down the cervical mucus production, the progesterone levels have to climb high enough for that to happen, right? So what we could be observing is just that maybe your progesterone levels are kind of slowly climbing. Eventually they get to the point that they're going to shut down the mucus production, but that could be part of it. Because until the progesterone gets high enough to change the texture of the cervix, have you noticed that the cervical mucus production stops? Like, does that coincide with the changes in your cervix itself? Like
it will take several days for the cervix to harden and close and lower. it'll take a few days after the mucus stops for the cervix to change position to firm, low, and closed.
Okay. Does it kind of line up ish? When the cervix is closed, there's no longer any clear, stretchy mucus?
Right. Once the cervix changes position in the luteal phase, like that's it.
Yeah.
That's it until my period comes.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's, because okay, so even what I'm observing on your most recent chart here, the one that we are in the middle of right now, is that right? Let's see what,
Yes.
yeah, because it's the 13th today. Okay. So what I'm observing here on this chart is that we have kind of this slow little arc. So your temperatures are kind of stable, and then we're seeing kind of this like slow rise of temperatures. So ultimately, your temperature is a reflection of what we're seeing. Like it's a reflection of your progesterone levels because it's the progesterone that makes your temperature rise. So it would just, to me, that's indicating that we have this slow increase of hormones. And you mentioned a few things at the top of the call. You mentioned that you had identified an autoimmune issue, and you also identified that there's a few things that you're working on. And you said you weren't sure what the trigger was for all of this stuff.
Right.
From what I remember, there was a few things that you were working on. Let me just take a peek at when we had a session. So not the most recent one, but we had a session in October, and at that time, you had mentioned that you'd been working with your functional practitioner. You had identified that you had 2 chronic viral infections, Epstein-Barr and the cytomegalovirus, and that you were kind of working on a protocol with your functional practitioner to essentially help your body to clear those.
Right.
So where are we at today with that situation?
My fatigue has gotten worse over the past couple of months. So we are unclear as to what the core trigger is. But what complicates it is when we try to take action on certain things, like we tried to do a liver cleanse, we tried to support the immune system to clear these viral infections. Whenever we push one of these systems just a little too far, that makes me crash and my energy will tank and I'll lose days from work and stuff like that. And it's not really a sustainable lifestyle. So for going forward, now we're going to have to like throttle way back and do something very gentle and easy so that I can still continue to live my life and get to work and slowly, just much more slowly start to attack these issues. So I'm wondering if without all the supplements pushing these different symptoms and driving all these reactions, if the charts are going to change, because I'm wondering if that noise, that static is showing up in the hormones, because there's also an adrenal component to this whole thing as well.
Well, yeah, because what we're seeing basically on your chart is that your body is struggling to pump out the progesterone quickly. So I've seen a lot of charts, as you know. And so what I typically will see will be like when in ovulation, it's not always the same, but typically it doesn't take, say, 4 or 5 days for the progesterone to raise high enough to actually shut everything down. So typically it depends. Every woman's different. So sometimes I'll see a little spike and then like a big one. But if I just take a moment here to show you. So basically what I'm showing Lindsey is just the graph of the estrogen and progesterone profile, the hormonal changes. Because I just want you to have that picture in your mind. So typically we would expect to see after ovulation, your progesterone like shoot up. So it's not going to be at the top the first day or anything. But by about 6 or 7 days after ovulation, we should be hitting this peak. So it's typically quite a quick rise. So there could be a lot of different reasons for that. The one thing, I mean, the chart gives us lots of information. It doesn't always tell us why. So it doesn't always say, this is the reason why your progesterone isn't raising really quickly. But what we know is that your body's struggling with this virus. What we know is that you're dealing with symptoms of fatigue. This could be affecting your adrenal function. And those things are related to hormonal production. So really what it comes down to is it's all related. So once we can figure out how to support your body with what it's struggling with. So in terms of the virus, that was picked up on a test. Has
Mhm.
your practitioner given you a time frame for retest, or have you been able to do that yet? Or are you planning kind of in the future, you're still working on everything and you're going to retest at some point in the future?
We will retest out sometime in the future, but I think the goal is to figure out the trigger first and try to get my energy level to return, because that seems to be her focus at the moment right now. Is just how can we get me more energy so I can get through my day without as much struggle.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my questions for this is, because I kind of, what little I know from the class that you taught about estrogen dominance versus progesterone. I'm wondering, is this estrogen dominance, or is that not what this is?
So the word estrogen dominance, what it typically refers to, I think the word itself makes it seem like we have like this, like just a ton of estrogen, like your estrogen is high. But what that term reflects in the context of your chart is kind of excess estrogen compared to progesterone.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about what a typical average chart we would expect it to look like, we would expect to see in the pre-ovulatory phase about as many days before ovulation as afterwards. So we would expect to see kind of it's even. Like if you think an average cycle is about 29 days, 28, 29 days. So we have about half of the cycle where we have estrogen and half where we have progesterone. So these things should balance out.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question, I mean, it is possible if your progesterone levels aren't really getting to where they need to be. I can see clearly that you are ovulating. Your post ovulatory temperatures, it looks like they're a little bit on the low side, but it's kind of hard to tell overall. Like I would expect to see at least, one temperature that goes over 37 degrees Celsius. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
talking about Celsius. But it's kind of hard to tell. So you're like this rise that we're seeing here would indicate that's a little low. So if you think about that term meaning your estrogen compared to progesterone, the ratio, then if the progesterone is a little bit on the low side, then yes, that doesn't necessarily mean your estrogen is high, but compared to the progesterone, they need to be in balance. It could mean that, if that makes sense. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, okay. I'm trying to contextualize it because I don't want you to think, oh my gosh, I have like super high estrogen, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you have high estrogen, but it could mean more like unopposed.
Okay.
So it is a possibility, but just in the sense that related to the progesterone levels. What's your stress like these days?
It's pretty high in terms of pushing through fatigue to get life accomplished.
Hmm.
And that's really the sole source of it, is just the big question mark of what is this and how am I going to get past it.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you wake up full of energy, ready to go, like want to work out just because you just have so much energy and it's like, yes, my gosh, I feel like going for a run. And one being that, like, yeah, the one being you can't really crawl out of bed at all. Where are you?
I'm usually around a 3.
Most days.
Most days I'm around a 3. On a good day, I'm a 4 or 5. And on the days when I have to call out, I'm a 1 or a 2.
And when was the last time you were at like a 7 or 8?
I don't really remember.
Wow.
It would have been a special occasion. Like if it were, I mean, I can turn on, I can wake up, so to speak, on command if I have, a stressful day or a presentation at work or something that gets that dump of adrenaline, I can turn on, but I know it's going to cost me energy later in the day.
Well, do you remember, even if it was like, it sounds like it was a while ago, but do you remember the last period of time in your life where you actually didn't feel this way, or has it just been too long?
I remember it got much worse about 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. Prior to that, it was like a slow decline up to that. Because now looking back, of course, I can kind of see I had allergies all growing up, and that could be an indicator of autoimmunity. A lot of little signs like that were always with me. The depression that would come and go, stuff like that. And it would traditionally be triggered by some kind of a life event, like a breakup or a move or a job change or whatever, something stressful, but it would linger like way too long. So those clues I kind of always had with me, but it didn't really interfere with my life. And I didn't really notice it until I took the steps I thought, you're supposed to take, get out of a stressful job and get out of a stressful relationship and improve things, take action to fix these things. And the symptoms didn't resolve. So that's when I knew that there was something else going on there, and I had to look into it. And it took me 3 doctors to finally get someone to test my thyroid antibodies through those 2.5 years and 3 doctors.
Wow.
Yeah.
When was last time then that you did your thyroid panel with your practitioner?
It was in the very beginning, so probably 6 months ago. I would have data for the 6 months ago.
Okay. And so since that was identified, and you mentioned that you were identified with Hashimoto's, what have you been doing? What is kind of the protocol you're following now with your practitioner?
For the Hashimoto's, that's kind of taken the back seat because the viewpoint is that Hashimoto's is a symptom of something else. So while I did show antibodies to my thyroid, it was low enough on the scale to where if we stopped the attacks, if we eliminate the trigger, my thyroid is still functional enough that I might be able to recover and go into remission to the point where I won't need thyroid hormone. So I'm not on thyroid hormone at the moment. Maybe a non-standard case because my doctor and I are going through the steps logically. I'm consuming a lot of podcasts and information about this stuff. I'm trying to learn my way out of it. We're going through the list of what ifs, and we just haven't gotten far enough down the list to find my what if. In theory, once we get there, then we'll be able to create a plan. But it's like we don't really know how to go forward until we know what it is. She told me, like, she gets a new client in with these symptoms, she gives them a plan, and 50% of them come back and they feel great. And that's really all they needed. Clean up their diet and then they feel wonderful. Some clients take a little bit longer, maybe a couple months, but a 7-month discovery phase is really non-standard. And at this point, it's a fairly expensive endeavor to try to go down the functional medicine rabbit hole. That's also another reason for sort of throttling back and saying, okay, let's make sure I can still live my life and do this at the same time.
Yeah. In this chart, like the temperatures were a bit up. Post-op temperatures aren't looking, they drop off a little, but overall they're still looking okay. Was there a difference in how you felt in December to now?
Yeah, December was a much better month overall. In January, like once I got the flu in January, it was just downhill from there because I got the flu, then I got a sore throat, and then I inadvertently dairy poisoned myself.
Oh no.
Which was a separate form of awful.
Yeah.
But yeah, January is a struggle. I did remember December as and I kind of had some chronic hip and knee pain, and that had subsided in December. So that was a good sign that, like, okay, maybe what we're doing is going to work. Mm-hmm. And then January hit and all.
Because you can see it, because in December, so you can see, like, you had several days of mucus leading up to ovulation. And then it looks like, although you did have mucus a little, like on this one day afterwards, like the mucus didn't go on and on after ovulation. Mm-hmm. Like it did subside. And although I do see here, like did you have any spotting? Do you ever have spotting premenstrually or no?
Yes. So in the next cycle, I had quite a bit of spotting. So it was like 1 day prior and 3 days afterwards, there was spotting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just asked because I see this sharp drop in temperature, which would indicate that your progesterone levels were falling. Do you have any PMS symptoms or?
Not really. I get reclusive. Like emotionally, I just want to recede. But beyond that, I really don't have any PMS symptoms.
Okay. Yeah. So you can see the difference. So here you can see, like, this is where I want to see your temps. Like in this area, that's where I want to see them for the most part, above 36.4 centigrade Celsius. And then you can see here that although the temp pattern, like I would still, the drop and all of that, but with that being said, like we still, and then of course, like we got all that, but at least there's a couple points where it's hitting 37. So this is kind of what is telling me, okay, like it looks like the hormones are getting like on the up and up. So then we have the December chart. I can see the days of illness. So we've got a little spiky, but as you can see, your post-ovulatory temperatures are struggling a little. So then the question, and then I see that you had some bleeding here. Oh, that was just when you're checking your cervix.
Well, that's what I call spotting. So that's how I'll note
Yeah.
spotting.
Yeah. Well, and so this is telling me something because your
Mm-hmm.
progesterone levels aren't as high because we're seeing the temps aren't as high. So it's kind of like what the, it prompts me to ask, is there something stressful going on? Was it like, and so you mentioned that there was a few different things going on in December. And then kind of leading into the next chart here, this is telling me that your body's really struggling. So it could be a combination of things, something robbing, like something stressful in your body that is robbing you of your progesterone, basically.
Yes.
Something is stealing the progesterone. And so that's what we want to figure out. So yeah.
So question for you then, as far as birth control purposes go,
Yeah.
Sometimes I have mucus after ovulation, but can I still start the count of 3 after ovulation, or do I need to start it after the mucus?
Well, so in order to be ultra conservative to make sure that we're following the rules correctly, unfortunately, my suggestion to you is so like the most conservative application of the rules would be to actually wait until you have your peak day and do a count of 3 after peak, meaning that, so let's say for this chart here, if this is truly, so day 17, if that is truly the last day that you saw mucus that is clear or stretchy or slippery, then we would do a count of 3 here. So day 18, 19, and 20 would be fertile. And if 21 was a dry day, then you'd consider yourself infertile the evening after that.
Okay.
So it'd be like the later of, like you have the temperature rules and you have the mucus rules, and we would be following the later of the two.
Gotcha. Okay.
So obviously, there are some women that just use one or the other. So they would just use the temperature rules. I can't tell you what to do. I could tell you that the most conservative way to do it, to follow the rules correctly, is to wait until those two things match up. The challenge with temperature, it really depends on what's happening here. So even in this chart here, your temperature rise is creeping. And ultimately, the whole reason that we use temperature is to confirm when ovulation has happened. But essentially, the temperature helps us to confirm that your like you have ovulated, A, the progesterone has risen high enough to dry up your mucus, B, and to close your cervix. So we're waiting for the shop to close. Right. So what you're telling me from what we talked about before is that when you check your cervix, it can take a couple of days before your cervix actually becomes firm and hard and closed. So ultimately, for birth control purposes, you would be waiting for those, like the 2 primary signs, and then the mucus or the cervical position sign is a confirmation.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. Although it's a little disheartening because my luteal phases tend to be short already. So that gives me a very small window of not worrying about it.
Yes. There's a fine line that I walk between, like obviously, if this was a different conversation, you were trying to conceive, I wouldn't be advising you to wait until like after your temperature shift to try to conceive. But it's a different ballgame when you're avoiding pregnancy. The rules are giving you that little bit of buffer to ensure that you're not getting pregnant. So the challenge, there's a couple challenges here. One of the challenges is that your chart isn't always going to be like this. So part of the work that we're doing is to try to identify what the heck it is that's stressing your body out, that is messing with your progesterone levels and causing this kind of slow situation to happen. So once your cycles are healthy, once you're addressing the problem, once you've addressed those underlying viruses, once you've addressed thyroid function, then you would expect to see it go back to what we have seen in the past, where we see an ovulation and your temp does spike and it stays up. So again, this is inconvenient, very inconvenient, but at the same time, that's why there's 2 parts to the process. Right. So that's the thing. It's not going to be like this forever, but this is exactly why we pay attention to all these details on the chart, to know that it shouldn't be like that. And we know that your body's giving us information about all of the things that it's like, if your body, I had this thing flash to your mind? It's like, oh, the troubles I've seen. Like your body's trying to tell us a story here.
Yeah.
Oh, the troubles I've seen.
It's very loud. It's painting an interesting picture.
Well, yeah. So as we bring it to close, one thing that in terms of the birth control conversation, have you been using the pre-ovulatory phase at all, or how have you been managing your fertility otherwise outside of?
Well, this cycle is the first cycle. It's been an issue, and I was a little hesitant to try it in the pre-ovulatory phase simply because the pre-op phase for me seems to, I don't know, it's kind of cosmic in the sense that the mucus can stretch out for a week or more. And I don't usually have many, I think my average is like 2 or 3 days of dry before it starts. So in my mind, that was a bit of a gamble, but it was the withdrawal method. And so from then on out, it's alternative sex until I'm completely sure that ovulation is passed and the mucus is gone.
Well, so to kind of review pre-ovulatory best practices, we talked about menstruation in the group setting. So when it's that it's actually your period, you've ovulated 12 to 14 days beforehand. If you have days of heavy or moderate bleeding, then those days you can consider to be infertile. So that's for experienced charters. If you are an inexperienced charter, you consider those days to be fertile until kind of further notice. But so you would consider any days of heavy or moderate bleeding to be infertile. And then on the days of light or very light bleeding, if you're able to check for mucus, we talked about that. So have you found that you are able to check on your very light days of your period?
I use the menstrual cup now from the beginning to the very end. And so I'm not checking intentionally because I'm not considering intercourse during that time anyway.
Okay. So then those days you would have to consider potentially fertile. Mm-hmm. So then on your dry days, basically what you're doing is you're checking for mucus throughout the day, all day. As you said, you're like laser on it. And then if at the end of the day, so in the pre-ovulatory phase, we're following the like evenings of rule. So if at the end of the day it's been dry all day, then that is a day that you would consider to be infertile. And then if you have sex, then we talked about the semen elimination technique in the group. So to get rid of the semen so that the following day you could again check your observations and be confident in what you're seeing. Mm-hmm. And then of course, every woman manages her fertility in a way that she feels comfortable with. So all days of mucus obviously are fertile days. And when you're in the pre-ovulatory phase, I've had a number of clients who will kind of wait for that shift. So they're paying very close attention, asking that question of, is today about the same as it was yesterday? So doing that essential sameness question. And once you see that shift, that now you're like, okay, this is different. I'm starting to see mucus now. I wasn't seeing it before. So it's something different than the day before. Then you can consider yourself kind of in your fertile window and hold off until we've confirmed ov. So there's different ways to do it, but that's a conservative way to just so you think of your cycle and then you think of this chunk as a fertile window in the middle. So hopefully that is a helpful review.
Yes, no, that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So as we wrap up our interview, because we've we've talked. But yeah, so as we wrap up our interview today, for anyone who's listening who may have had a similar story to you or may still be using hormonal birth control or anything like that, what advice, if any, would you want to give to her?
First and foremost, I would say have patience with yourself. That's something I'm actively struggling with, which is funny because struggle is not the right word to pair with patience. But, I forget sometimes that it's my doctor's job to figure out what's going on and to help me fix it. It's my job to live in my body and live in the world while we're figuring this out together. And so, I have my routine of all my little self-care items that I do throughout the day, but I still need to go out and have a good time with my friends. And I still need to go have a good meal and not worry that I'm going to inadvertently dairy poison myself or something like that. So you can only do as well as what you know. And so I came to this information after hijacking my cycle for 18 years. And I could spend time feeling guilty about that, or I could do the best that I can today. And that changes from day to day. Obviously, like the resources I have today are different than the resources I have tomorrow. And I do the best you can. And if today is a down day, then don't worry about it, because tomorrow, like Scarlett O'Hara says, tomorrow is another day. You get another chance to try it out. So having patience can be one of the biggest challenges, especially when there's a lot of unknowns and it's kind of hard to get through. And if you don't have your own patience, feel free to outsource it to your friends. If your friends can be optimistic on your behalf, then take advantage of that too.
Yes, I think those are, sound guidance, sound words. So thank you for that. And for anybody who, I know you shared a little bit about your experience in the group, but for anyone who's thinking about joining one of the programs or going that extra step, I think the internet has made fertility awareness charting really feel like a DIY project. And as someone who's in the midst of it all, who I didn't learn by myself, I definitely did read books and, do a bit of self-learning, but I don't have the experience of being completely self-taught. So what, if any, advice or information would you want to share with someone who's kind of like, I don't know if it's worth it to like actually learn it on my own, or to go and, can I just learn it on my own type of thing?
I'm sure you could to a certain degree, but if you have any challenges or any history of anything that might impact your cycle, I would highly recommend the class, because in our first session together, I had just taken out my IUD, and I was like, I don't even know if I'm going to have a cycle during the course of this class. Am I still, because if it doesn't come back, am I still going to learn enough to be able to do this? And your advice was perfect, because it was like, even if my cycle doesn't get on track and we don't have data points to look at yet, I'm still going to be learning from the other individuals in the group. And that's exactly what happened. And we had a wide variety of experiences in our class. We had some individuals that had never been on hormonal birth control, and their cycles looked different. And then we had some others that were like me, that had long-term birth control use, but maybe their trends and their charts were different from mine. So it's neat to see the different, it kind of turned into a data nerd in something like this, and it's neat to see how it all presents in different situations, stuff like that. So for me, it was absolutely crucial. I would not have had the confidence to do this on my own if I had tried to learn this out of books. Like, the community is so helpful and supportive and welcoming. I mean, we can literally talk about anything in this group, and it's totally a safe space.
All the fluids, all of the things.
All the things.
Oh, Lindsey, it has been my pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your experience. I know there's so many women who are listening to our very private, private-ish conversation, but I know that it really helps women, because I hear the feedback all the time. And I know you've listened to some of the previous Fertility Awareness Series episodes, so I know that, I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be a part of it. I've gotten so much out of other women's stories, and hopefully someone can learn from mine as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/190. That's fertilityfriday.com/190. I hope that you enjoyed my episode with Lindsey. It was great to have her on the show. And of course, a special thank you to Lindsey for coming on the show and sharing her story. I always enjoy doing the fertility awareness reality sessions. It just gives a great window into what it's really like to work with clients, what it's really like to learn the fertility awareness method. And I know that my clients really appreciate these sessions. Also very informative to really kind of give that hands-on idea of what this whole charting thing is all about. So I hope that you enjoyed our session. I feel like we covered quite a bit. And in the end, talking about applying the fertility awareness method for birth control, which is something I realized I haven't talked about on the podcast too specifically that frequently. So I'm thinking about doing an episode just on kind of optimizing the fertility awareness method for birth control in the near future. So inspired by my session with Lindsey. So I still have a few spaces open in my upcoming Fertility Awareness Mastery group program. We'll be starting our sessions in April of 2018. And so I'd really love to have you in there. If you are thinking about joining the group, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for details. And we'll be chatting about today's episode in the Fertility Friday Facebook community. So if you're not yet in the Facebook group, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/community to join us in there. And I just want to thank you for joining me today. Thank you for supporting the show, for listening to this episode. It's because of all of you listening that I podcast, and it's because of all of you that the show continues to grow, that more and more women continue to find it, and ultimately that more and more women are discovering how their body works, how their fertility really works, and gaining this important knowledge that all of us should really have been taught in junior high school. So thank you so much for being a part of this. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.